that they would let you go through, it, but you got to pay all the course fees.
Yeah.
Now
That was,
how much is the course fees? That's a whole other maybe with you. Right.
Yep.
Let me get out of your way.
All right. Bring that door to with you when you come, please, sir.
Huh?
I said,
Shut the door for us.
bringing the door to you when you come. All right, we're on page 182 in the scheme of redemption. We're talking then about the Sabbath, the sabbatical year, if you go back to 180. And so we've mentioned some things that the sabbatical year, agricultural suspension, then that had, of course, because of that, they weren't planting and sowing, so there was the spontaneous production, and that went on for 2 years, really. The third year, then you got to plant, and so then also debts were remitted, and also in the year of Jubilee, that was true, buying and property and then giving it back to the proper owner, and also slaves. You would that was in the year of Jubilee, and I don't know if he does. Yeah, he does with that too. All right, so we are talking about then that this institution was much neglected by the Hebrews, and it was then because of the neglect of this that they went into captivity. If you go back, and Jeremiah knows that Babylonian captivity, because they did not keep the 7 years. It's interesting then what he says then, but that it was observed to some extent sufficiently so to test God's fidelity to his promise. It is proved then. Notice number 1 then, and we're not going to notice through all of these, but I want to notice number 1, the sabbatical years, including the year of Jubilee, from Moses to the captivity was about 137. Now that's not years. From Moses to the captivity, that's not years. That's sabbatical years. So you've got to multiply that, okay, by 7, and in order to get those number of years from those. All he's mentioning here is the fact that it was 137 years, or 100, of sabbatical years. Yes, and I struggled with that because when you look at from
how often did the sabbatical year?
Every 7 years.
Okay.
Okay, and so when you do that, because the judges were like 315 years. So I knew that, something was wrong. So I had to reread this.
315?
The judges were.
Right.
Yeah. And so that's what he's talking about there. We're not going to get into the book of Maccabees. This is the Apocryphas and those type of thing, which is doubtful, but they are useful for some things. And then there's the testimony of Josephus, and then from a testimony of Tacitus, and I don't know who that is, but the rest of them I do know. So anyway, let's talk about the year of Jubilee. All right. The etymology of the word Jubilee is somewhat doubtful, and that's fine. It's supposed to denote primarily a ram, and that may be.
I don't understand. Supposedly to denote primarily
a ram. Yeah, Jubilee. Then the etymology of it came from ram, supposed to be from ram. Doesn't mean that it was, but that's what. So we didn't lose some of the etymology of some words there.
Yeah.
All right, and then also.
This is every 50 years.
Yes. To shout for joy and triumph. And I think that's more of what he's talking about here. Then he thinks that this year was so called because it was introduced on the evening of the Day of Atonement, with the sound of a trumpet, with the shoutings throughout the whole land. Leviticus 25:9. All right. The law of this institution is given in Leviticus chapter 25, verses 8 through 55, and is provided. It should be celebrated every 50 years, beginning on the 10th day of the 7th month, as we've read then. Ford had a tractor called Jubilee, and it was the 50th year of that. It's interesting how some folks then may not be religious, but they take some religious things and apply it to their lives. And I find that interesting. That at the beginning of this year, all Israelites who through poverty or otherwise have become slaves should go free. That during this year, the land should remain fallow or uncultivated. And it had then during the seven proceedings sabbatical year. So you had on this one, you had a sabbatical year right before it. Then you had this year. And so it was interesting then how God would provide for them for those years then that they did not plant. All that all unredeemed lands, houses in the country and villages, and also the Levitical houses in the cities should at the beginning of this year be restored to their original owners. So everything was based then, if you borrowed and sold, it was based on the sabbatical or on the year of Jubilee. That's what they based it on. That's what the property was worth from Jubilee to Jubilee. And as you got closer to the Jubilee, your price of your land went down. Same thing with the price of slaves and that type of thing too. All right, the design of the year of Jubilee seems to be fourfold. Number one, to remind the Jews that God was the rightful owner and proprietor of their lands. God owns it all anyway. Okay. Number two, to remind them that their own equality as the sons of Israel and subjects of Jehovah. No Israelite could be retained in servitude contrary to his own will beyond a limited time or a limited period. Number three, to cultivate a sense of their dependence on God and of their obligation to Him. They had to depend. That they had this, the 49th, it would be the 49th, but it would be the 7th. Anyway, you understand what I'm saying there. That would be the sabbatical year. Then you'd have the year of Jubilee. So you had 2 years there that you weren't planning, at least 2 years, that you weren't planning or anything, okay? For this purpose, the extraordinary fruitfulness of the second year preceding the Jubilee was particular well adapted. The Jubilee, number 4 then, I have no idea. Somebody from Huntsville.
The Jubilee zone. Number 4.
Yeah, let me cut this off. The Jubilee served to magnify even more than the sabbatical year the great importance of our release from sin and of the liberty, rights, and immunity of which we have even now an earnest and a foretaste in and through Christ, by which we can never fully appreciate and enjoy till the conflicts of life are over, and this whole earth, purified by fire, shall be restored to the redeemed as their proper and rightful inheritance. Now, they had a funny idea about Christ coming again. And you see some of it here later on in the book. We'll not get to there because we're not going to get to there. I'm not going to deal with that. But they had some funny ideas about the end time. They had some funny ideas of what would take place with the kingdom and that type of thing, which we can see in denominationalism have accepted some of those things. So it's almost like the rejuvenated earth and that type of thing there. So just wanted to bring that out. I think some of that's true. Not all of the earth purified by fire. Second Peter chapter 3 says it's going to be burned up. The elements and the works that are in shall be destroyed. And I think that's true, literally, okay? All right, finally, we have in this institution as well in the sabbatical year the most clear and convincing evidence of the divine litigation of Moses and also indeed of the divine origin of the whole Bible. Now, I think that is important too. So we see that in those things then, okay? And there may be some things. All right, let's turn the page over to 186 at the bottom there, chapter 7. The giving of the law, Mount Sinai, to the rest in Canaan. So that's what time we're going to do there. I'm really disappointed in his time that he deals with from, I think it's from the Judges then, until the end of the Old Testament there. He really just kind of skips over it, tells you to study it. All right, I think there's importance there. In the book of Numbers then, it's the next book that we need to notice. We account then the numbering of Israel. We need to know how many was in that first number and also in the second numbering. So if you'll get that, there was 603,550. 603,550.
That's in the first number?
That's in the first numbering. And I think he does give the numberings there. Yes, if you'll notice on page 192. And if you go down to number 3, we'll get to this. You'll see the 1,730. You'll need
That's the second number?
Yes, that's the second number. You'll need to know those two numbers. And there is a significance in that. The 603,550 are those then are 20 years old and upward. So is the 601,730. That's the ones who were, 20 years old and upward. And that 603,550, only 2 of those got to enter into Canaan. So subtract 2 and then find out how many days are in 40 years. And then divide that into the 603,550, and you'll see on an average how many funerals they went to, which will be a lot of funerals. They had to bury a lot of people. And I thought always, 10, 15. No, it's a lot more than that. Okay. So here is the book of Numbers, and what it begins with then is the numbering, and that's what's important. But there's some other important issues here in the book of Numbers. Yes. We also find the order of their march and their encampment leading to these things. And if you look on page 187, you'll see and it's interesting then, you have the east, and he has the east, what I would think it'd be in the north position. But he has it in the up position there, the first division then, the camp of Judah.
It's where the tabernacle is.
Yes, I understand that. But here are then...
And that's where Moses, Aaron, and the priest are at the opening.
Yes. And then you find that the priest then... Well, you find the Levites were around that. And you find then that guard around there. But these priests and Levites had to make this thing so that they could, when they traveled, this thing would be packed up and ready to go for traveling. So when you think about the tabernacle and you're seeing all of that in the end of Exodus, and then you get into Exodus and Numbers, and the reason he scoops Deuteronomy is the second giving of the law. That's when Moses then has about 3 speeches, and he gives then those speeches over the last couple of months of his life, and it is the second giving of the law. That's what Deuteronomy means. And so you can find a lot of that then in the book of Exodus, and there'll be some other things that would be added to that too. But here then you see how they were going to travel. Now they haven't got to the 40 years of wilderness wanderings. They have not then. This is going to be when they leave Mount Sinai and go up to the land of Canaan. This is how they're going to travel.
Okay, so the book of Numbers is leaving Sinai and going to Canaan.
But then when you get to chapter 13, okay, that's when
Canaan was the promised land.
That's right, it was. Okay, so they were going to the promised land. But then in chapter 13, they send out the 12 tribes, or the 12 spies. Okay, the 12 spies, 10 of those spies come back with the evil report. And they are then going to go into 40 years of captivity, or not captivity, of wandering one day.
Can I ask a dumb question?
40 years for one day.
The spies go into Canaan, right?
Yes, and they spy it out.
And that's when they bring back the big grapes and all that.
That's
right?
correct. That's correct. That's correct.
And that's when they come back and say, we are the grasshopper.
Yes. All right. That's the end of Numbers 13.
And that's when God tells them they've got to wander.
Yes, because of their unbelief. Okay. But before we get to that, in Numbers 14, God's going to, or some of the people are going to go against God and go up anyway. And God says, you're not going to make it. The Ark of the Covenant does not go up with them. And so they don't make it. There's some of those then are destroyed right there.
It's just a variety of boats from the various tribes.
Yes, I think so. You'd have to go back. But this is how then, as they are, then when they're doing their 40 years of wilderness wandering because of this, this is when you see how they're going to do this. And really, to me, you'd have to have it turned this way to be, like this. You'd have your book turned sideways. Because I always think the east to my,
Just drops.
left there.
Yeah.
Okay. And that would put everything, the south down, then west is to your left and north is up.
Yeah, it should be like this.
Yeah. So, and then you see this. Now, remember the Kohathites. There's that rebellion then. And there's some other folks involved in that rebellion against, and you see where they are. They are.
It says the Levites are numbered from 30 to 50 years of age, not 20.
Yes.
So just that group, that's why it's such a small number.
Well, now, understand something, and that's what I want to talk about this. I do have this then. Right underneath that, it says, in the preceding estimate, the Levites are numbered from 30 to 50 years of age according to Numbers. The other tribes were from 20 years when they were free from military service. The scriptures then nowhere define this limit, but the rabbis fix it at the age of 60. I thought it was from 30 to 50. But anyway, now there's the reason they do number the Levites, and this number then is because they take the number of Levites, and there is a formula that they do so that they can pay the taxes.
Yeah.
There's a temple tax on that. Okay. Now, he gives the number here. The rabbis estimate the extent of this camp would have been about 12 miles square. Now, that's important too. Okay. Right under, on page 188, I don't know if you followed us there. Okay. So this is 12 square miles. All right.
Where is it? Oh, I see it. Second full paragraph. I mean, the second
Yeah.
mark.
There was something else I told you was key. What was that? I know the numbering on page 190. That's a key too.
Well, what they called the divisions was more than just a tribe. It was like the division, the camp of Judah was Judah, Issachar.
Yeah, so I'm gonna get into that. Okay. But then now he's going to talk about this then. Okay. So this is not a little encampment. This is, you figure 12 square miles. Okay. According to traditions, the ensign of Judah was lion, and of Reuben a man's face, and of Ephraim a calf, and Dan an eagle. This may help the reader to understand some of the symbols used in Revelation chapter 4. Okay. And I think that's also.
We talk about Christ being the Lion of Judah.
That's right. He is from the lion. All right, now.
I said the Lion.
Yeah, Judah. All right, that's true. The order in which the tribes marched were given is Numbers chapter 10. You find then Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun. And then you find, notice number 2, the Gershonites bearing the covers, the veils, the hangings of the tabernacle. All right, you'll see that again too. The Mirianites with its boards, pillars, bars, pillars, and sockets. Okay. And he doesn't have the Kohathites here.
They're number 5.
Oh, okay.
They got Reuben, Gad, Simeon.
That's right.
Gad.
Then you have the Kohathites, and let's just drop down there to the Kohathites, okay? And the Kohathites then bearing the sacred vessels. That means that they were carrying these things on their shoulder.
The rest of them had carts, right?
That's right.
The Gershonites and all them.
That's right, because of the heaviness.
Heavy.
The heaviness. But you understand now, these men carried these things on their shoulders. And
but they had like those
rods. Yeah, that's what I was getting to. If you go back to the book of Exodus, when they were making these things, we find from Hebrews chapter 8 that God told Moses to build all things according to the pattern shown thee in the mount. So there was a pattern then that Moses knew and had access to, and here was what they were doing. But the Kohathites then, these rods that went through there, overlaid with gold, that's how they carried these things, and they were responsible then for carrying these things on their shoulders. Okay. Then the priest, this was their usual position in the army, but it seems that on occasion they bore the ark in front, and that is true too. But they had to get this folded up into these carts and taken care of when they started, when the cloud left or the pillar of fire left, they had to get these things ready. And it's interesting how they did this. This was not a little tent. Okay.
No, it was made out of animal skin. If you ever tried to pick up an animal skin,
It's
they're kind of heavy.
All right. Now, notice under Dan, Asher, and Naphtali, that's not Naphtali, by the way. It's Naphtali. It's Naphtali.
Naphtali, according to your British.
Yep. All right. The signal for marching was always the removal of the cloud from the tabernacle. Okay. Numbers 9. The sounding then of the silver trumpets were merely to indicate the time when the divisions were required to move. For instance, on the sounding of the first alarm, the camp of Judah. Now that's talking, when he talks about the camp of Judah, he's talking about Issachar and Zebulun too. So that whole side right there, when the sound was going forth, that was the first sounding, those people left. Okay.
And then you started moving the tabernacle.
Well, we'll get to that.
Right after the first.
We'll get to that.
That's what it said.
Okay, where did it say that?
It says Judah, Issachar, and Zebulun, and then after that, the Gershonites. So they're bearing
That's right.
the tabernacle.
Yeah. That's right. Back on page 188. That's right. Okay. On the second, then that of Reuben. Yeah. So the people remained at Sinai for about 1 year, lacking 10 days. Okay. So all these things were prepared then. And the laws, the nation of Israel, really, they became a nation in that 1 year. There was the laws given. There was then the order for, and it could be, you can consider that laws too, how they would travel, sacrifices, all of that was given. Now they had a monarch with God as the head. And it was also a theocracy because God was the head. Right, and then he gives some things here. Then as they were traveling, the cloud was taken up from the tabernacle and the people moved forward. And he gives the places, Taberah, the wilderness of Paran? Yeah. Paran, okay. Here the Lord consumed some of them for complaining, and hence the name Terabah, which means burning. And then they moved forward. Then Kirbath.
Kibroth Hattaavah.
Okay. Here we have an account of the people's murmuring and also the appointing of the 70 elders. Now that's important right there. Okay. These 70 elders, this would become then the Sanhedrin. This is the beginning of that. When he talks about the elders in the New Testament, the elders, I'm talking about in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John. This is what he's talking about. Now, when we get to 2 Timothy, those elders are different. This is a different type of, but these 70 then, this is the background for what became the Sanhedrin.
Yeah, and Timothy is just talking about the elders within the church and
Right.
Christians, which they could have been Gentiles or
Right.
Jews, but these were all Jews.
That's right. All right, and these men were to assist in the general administration of the government. The elders were chosen from those who have been previously elected as these individuals here, centurions and whatever. We also find that there was a supply of quails, the people's eating to the excess, and then the plague sent among them. And this gets us to Kirjath, Kadesh Barnea, number 4 there. Okay. And from there, then they go, and this is the sending out of the 12 spies in the land of Canaan. Okay. So you'll need to know where those 12 tribes or 12 spies are sent from.
What, sent from like Kadesh Barnea?
Yep. And then underneath that, number 2 of the evil report brought back by 10 of the spies. Now, you understand how God had taken care of them, brought them out of Egypt, had destroyed Egypt, brought them, divided the Red Sea. They walked over on dry land. God had provided them with quail, with manna and quail. He did. God had provided all these things. God was taking care of them. And yet these men said, we can't go up and take the land. So they miss a blessing. And here's a sermon on this. They miss a blessing by not obeying God from the start.
Yeah.
That's right. And that's really Hebrews chapter 3 and chapters 3 and chapter 4, because it talks about their evil heart of unbelief.
Yeah, Joshua and Caleb were very thankful.
Yes, and they said, let us go up. We can do this. This is not a problem. We can do this.
Like
Okay.
David did with Goliath.
Yes, that big feller. Yep. Okay. And then from there, God's pronouncement. Look at number 6. God's judgment on all the murmurers over 20 years of age. Okay.
The 10 spies died from a plague.
Yep. And then number 9 of their rout by the Amalekites. Now that's there and needs to be, you need to under Amalekites because 1 Samuel chapter 15 this is the background for that, what takes place in 1 Samuel chapter 15. Yes. This is why. And he'll tell them I think it's in verse 1, he says, what they did to my children, okay, at this time.
Did the Amalekites come from one of the 12 tribes?
Not from one of the 12 tribes.
I mean, talking about who, like
No.
Tamar, who her children became, the Moabites and
Tamar,
her 2 children.
that's Levi.
Tamar.
Judah.
Judah and Tamar, their 2 children, they're twins.
Yeah.
Perez and whatever the other
Yeah.
name was. They became, I got it right in my Bible. They became the
No, they're
Moabites and the
no.
something.
That's Lot's.
Oh, is that Lot's kids?
That's right.
His
That's right.
incestual children?
That's right. That goes back to the book of Genesis.
Yeah.
All right. Look around Genesis 18:19.
I think I voted in the
That's when you have Lot. You have Ammonites and Moabites. Is it Moabites? Anyway, but that's from Lot and his incest with his.
Those two boys became something.
They were enemies.
And Tamar's kids. I'm
Yeah.
talking about.
Tamar.
Yeah, the one that had 2 babies by Judah.
No, they're in the line. They're in the lineage of Jesus.
Okay, they didn't get cast out.
No. No. Go to Matthew chapter 1. And look at verse 3. Okay.
Wait a minute, I'm trying to get to Matthew 1. I keep getting to Matthew 1 here.
We're on page 190 in the book. I don't know if you were there with the rest of it, but anyway. And there was some
Oh, I see.
question
Verse
about
3, it says Zerah of Tamar and Phares begat
these.
Esrom, and Esrom begat Aram.
That's right. So see, they're in the lineage. There was nothing happening there. Now, you had to go back.
But I know there's like the same name, like, because it says then so-and-so begat Aminadab, and I thought that was part of the.
No.
Dang it.
All right. In Exodus 19,
Exodus.
Genesis 19.
Well,
Look at verse
19
30.
is where you've got Lot.
Look at verse number 37.
Moab and Ammon, which is the
Ammonites. That's right.
And we're talking of the
Amalekites.
Amalekites.
That's it.
Okay.
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 All right. So we were talking about the Amalekites, number 9, there on page 190. And the background of that is the background for 1 Samuel chapter 15. Okay. So here is then their wilderness wanderings. We're not going to go over that. All right. On page 191, under number 23, they were at Kadesh Barnea again. And here occurred several events worthy of notice as we learned from Numbers chapter 20. Now, when they hit here, we're talking pretty close to the 40 years of wilderness wandering are over. We're getting real close because Miriam died. You're going to find that Miriam died, Aaron dies, and then Moses dies within it's very quick, okay? All right, Miriam dies first. And then we find this would be Numbers 20 when we find Moses then and Aaron speak, or they strike the rock rather than speak to the rock, and because of that, they don't get to enter the land of Canaan. All right, now under 25, we find that Aaron dies. And Eleazar then is made high priest. He's the oldest descendant of Aaron. He becomes the high priest. That's who becomes the high priest. All right.
He's the one that jumped out with the Korah rebellion
Yes.
and acted.
Yes, he's not the only one that did that. All right, now on page 192 on Mount Pisgah. Here, put for the range of mountains called Abiram. This is where then Moses is going to die, on one of the Mount Pisgahs. But then we find that here is also, they conquer Sihon, the king of the Amorites. We find that Moab, then by the way of Bashan, and Balaam then prophesied concerning Israel. It's interesting what Balaam says. I can only speak that which God tells me. But yet he still had to even, yes, he told him how to conquer. The Israelites then fell into idolatry. And here is then the second numbering of those people, 1,730. All right, now underneath that, notice number.
Only the men that are numbered?
Only the men, yes.
Okay.
But that doesn't mean the women didn't die. There may have been some women
I
too.
figured that, but I'm saying when they number them, it's say 603,000.
3,550.
It's at least twice that many.
That's
plus
right.
some youngins,
That's right.
Okay.
That's why they come up with the 1.2 million. If you double that, you know, you got over 1.2 million.
Okay.
Then if you add some children in, that you may get up to 2.5 million people. All right, so we're on Mount Pisgah. Look at number 4. After the numbering then, Moses delivered his great valedictorian address consisting of 33 chapters of the book of Deuteronomy. Near this also Moses died on top of Pisgah, a peak of Mount Nebo. I don't know it right now. But then we find the selection then of Joshua. Now Joshua, he helped Moses, and he was a helper of Moses on a lot of things. He went part way up to the mount, on Mount Sinai. He did some other things. So he was 80 and 5 years when he came into the land of Canaan, and he asked for a mountain. He was, I think it's in Ephraim that he asked for this, but anyway. Caleb? Maybe. Yeah. One of them asked for a mountain. Anyway.
I thought it was Caleb that asked for the mountain.
Maybe.
He was always kind of quiet in the background.
But anyway, here is Joshua. He becomes then, and if you look at Joshua chapter 1, he says there a couple of times, be of strong and of good courage. And because he is taking the place of Moses, and that had to be a fearful thing to take his place. And but he does it. He has given some of this the power that Moses had, but he did not have all of it. So in Joshua, we find the conquering of the land. And we're not going to go into all of that. That, to me, is a good course on Bible geography. And if you haven't had that, I would suggest that you take Bible geography. All right, on page, and he talks about this, some of that stuff there. Deuteronomy. On page 197. At the middle of it, then that's the second paragraph. If you look there, no unusual servitude, then that's one paragraph. The second paragraph, there was, moreover, in the case of the Canaanites, a typical necessity that they should be destroyed. As we have already said, the old institution was in its history as well as its laws and ordinances, a type of shadow of the new. 1 Corinthians chapter 10, verses 1 through 12. The bondage then of Israel and Egypt seems to have been intended as a type of bondage and sin previous to our conversion. Okay, that's true. The emancipation by Moses was a symbol of our deliverance by Christ. Moses was a mediator. Christ is our mediator. There's the types and the shadows. Just so the rest of the children of Israel in Canaan fitly represented the rest that all children of Abraham by faith will enjoy on. And I stop right there because as they gain paradise. Okay? I don't believe.
Not on earth. You can just cross
Right.
off on this earth.
Yes, it's not on this earth. Jesus can't rule on this earth. It's
So
not
we
wrong.
will enjoy in paradise.
Yes. That's Hebrews chapter 3 and chapter 4. There is that rest then that's involved. Okay. And then he does mention that the wicked inhabitants of the earth will be destroyed, 2 Peter chapter 3. So here is then.
It says it's going to be dissolved by fire. That's
Yeah.
very contradictory.
Yeah. I understand. I don't think they thought.
Didn't think it through.
No. All right, on page 199, we're going to talk then. This is the historical development from the death of Joshua to the birth of Christ. So we're going then from Joshua, we're starting with the Judges, and we're going through Malachi, and then 400 years. So he's going to cover this in about 2 pages. Okay? That's right.
Joshua to the Malachi is 400 years.
No.
Joshua to the Judges.
From Joshua to Malachi, and then from Malachi to Christ, or John the Baptist. From Malachi to John the Baptist is 400 years.
Malachi. How did Joshua get him?
Because what he does, he goes from Joshua, then look at the book.
Mm-hmm.
And the book says the historical developments from the death of Joshua to the birth of Christ. So he's on page 199.
I got it.
Okay. He's taking then huge, and he's going to deal with this from Judges to John the Baptist in a page and a half. Two. All right. Just look over there. And he's going to talk about the Gentile for a minute. We're going to slow down. There's some things in this that I think are worth us noting. He says, the history is but philosophy teaching by example. And I thought that was pretty good. Wow. This remark is certainly true within certain limits. And it explains to us, moreover, why it is that so much of the Bible is taken up with matters of history. All right? And you look then, if you consider and study your Bibles, you have after the law, all right, you take that division of 5:12, 5:5:12, right? First 5 then is the books of law. Then you have the historical books, okay? Then you have poetry, then you have major prophets, and then you have minor prophets. Now look at the, if you'll take the historical books, and I know Genesis has historical chronology. You go Genesis, Exodus, you take some of Numbers, and then those other portions of those books, like you kind of set them and say, okay, this is what happened during these times, but not chronology. Then you have Joshua overtaking the land, Judges, then 315 years. And then when you get to the end of 2 Chronicles, you're at the end, pretty close to the end of the Old Testament. You're at the end of the book of Malachi. And so you take then those major prophets and those minor prophets, and you see when they prophesied. And it's very interesting then when you do a chart, and I've done that chart then of those things.
Okay. 5 is the law, 12 is the
Historical.
and then poetry, and then major
Major minor prophets. That's right. 5, 12. 5, 5,
I
12.
always make sure I give it the right title.
Yeah. All right, so here is then, and in this then, we're talking about the scheme of redemption. And he misses some things there. Look at 2 Samuel chapter 7. You know, we have David. And what takes place with David? And here's a man after God's own heart. And here is David then wanting to establish the temple, but he's not able to do that.
But he accepts it.
Right, and it came to pass, but he does something. He gathers stuff for Solomon to build the temple. Solomon does some, but it's mostly gathered by David. And I think a lot of the plans, the basic plans, are gathered by David.
Because of the spoils of war.
Yes, it came to pass when the king sat in his house, and the Lord had given him rest round about from all the enemies, that the king said to Nathan, the prophet, "See, now I dwell in a house of cedar, but the ark of God dwelleth in curtains." And Nathan said, "Go." All right, and that's when and it came to pass that night that the word of the Lord came to Nathan. All right, now let me see. Now I want to try, let's see. Let's see, verse 9. "I was with thee whithersoever thou wentest, and have cut off thine enemies out of thy sight, and have made thee a great name, like unto the name of the great men that are on the earth, or in the earth. Moreover, I will appoint thee a place for my people Israel, and will plant them that they may dwell in a place of their own, and move no more, neither shall the children of wickedness afflict them any more, as before time." Now understand, now is when Jerusalem is going to become the capital of Israel. It was not beforehand. And that's when David then brings the Ark of the Covenant into Jerusalem. That's when it becomes the capital. And then Solomon builds the temple. But let's continue. "And as since the time that I commanded the judges to be over my people Israel, and have caused thee to rest from all thine enemies, also the Lord telleth thee that he will make thee an house. And when the days be fulfilled that thou shalt sleep with thy fathers, I will set up thy seed after thee, which shall proceed out of thy bowels, and I will establish his kingdom. And he shall build an house for my name, and I will establish the throne of his kingdom forever. And I will be his father, and he shall be my sons. If he commit iniquity, I will chasten him with the rod of men, and with the stripes of the children of men. But my mercy shall not depart from him, as I took it from Saul, and I put away before thee. And thine house and thy kingdom shall be established," watch this, "forever." Okay? "Before thee, thy throne shall be established forever." According to all the words, according to all this vision, so did Nathan speak to David. And then went King David in and sat before the Lord and said, "Who am I, O Lord God? And what is my house that thou hast brought me hitherto?"
Did he sit before the ark?
No, he couldn't.
He couldn't have gone into the tabernacle, right?
He
just went down in prayer.
Right. He went as far as he could. He didn't go
He probably went on his knees and prayed.
Yeah. "And this was a great small thing in thy sight, but thou hast spoken also of thy servant's house for a great while to come. And this is the manner of men, O Lord God." He knew then that this kingdom then was something bigger than he was.
But he took it very.
Yeah. And so there was Solomon. And then you'll see that there was no seed of David after Jeroboam and Rehoboam, that division there, but David always had a seed then that was sitting on the throne. No, Ahab was of the northern.
Oh, I thought he was.
No, he wasn't from David. All right, so here's then some things, and I'm sad that he misses some of those things, but that's important. That's 2 Samuel chapter 7. That's a prophecy then. That's the problem, to me, the problem, the scheme of redemption. Now, he does go back and talks about the prophets, and we'll notice that, some of the things. Let's see, where did I get to? More.
The Bible is taking up the matters of history when you start.
All right, this remarkable, certainly true, there's certain limits. Let's see. Oh, very few persons can ever become philosophers. Their talents and their learnings are not sufficient to enable them to grasp and comprehend the principles in abstract. But all responsible persons can, oh man, we need to take a break. We'll stop right there. Okay, take a little break.
Breaking.
That was a fast 50 minutes.
Mm-hmm. I was enjoying it.
Doofus.
And she heard every word you said. About what? About cleaning up. I mean, they're calling them. What are you wearing? Hold that shirt down. It's not cute. It's ugly. It's not ugly. Not cute. No, it's not. I never wear it. Even the lady at the register was like a 20-something year old girl. Well, maybe she might be considered. She's like, that's cute. It's stylish. It's cute. It looks comfortable. It looks like looking down the. Oh, it doesn't. I went and I put my.
All right.
No, they were watching. They were watching. We're not watching them again. They go in and out. They're being hugged. I know. Are you sure these things are not? I don't think so. What is her name? I'm going to be stuffing in the back of my closet. Right? Something. It's
Take care. Thank you.
Let's play some Scrabble. Sure. Sure.
something. You can't do that.
I can't.
No.
I think that.
You can't.
All I did was put my hands on it.
Yeah, but I'm trying to do something.
Oh my
Woman.
gosh, it's not that big. Oh, that's sweet.
No. No. Oh no.
Oh, buddy.
Oh, come on now.
Wow, I went way over
Well, what?
time. I went 20 minutes. Sorry.
It really wasn't 20 minutes. It was, because we didn't break until almost 25 after, so 15.
Okay. All right.
15.
All right.
50 we did.
That's what he said too. All right, we're on that page 199, and we're going to go slower through here because there's some good stuff into this. All right, all responsible people can at least comprehend a fact. Okay. Now that's all right. And they can apprehend it and they can comprehend it too. Okay. Most of them can be made to understand and comprehend it as an exponent then of the law of some law or principle. In this way, the elements of most sciences are taught and illustrated. And hence it pleased God to place the Jews under law and then to allow them to work out historically certain great problems for the benefit of mankind. Okay.
In other words, it's problems.
Yes. On the end of the bottom of that page, and hence we find that both prophets and apostles refer consistently to the Pentateuch for terms to express their religious ideas. Okay, and that is true. A lot. It's surprising the amount of things from your New Testament are found in the Old Testament.
Well, that's what the Jews basically.
I mean, it's
that's their life.
yeah. And so Jesus quoted it a lot.
Yes.
Then the apostles quoted the Old Testament a lot. Look at Acts chapter 2 and study Acts chapter 2 and see how much of that is a quotation from the Old Testament. All right. So other questions then require more time for their solution. Nothing short of a long series of experiments made under those most favorable circumstances could satisfactorily prove to mankind their own utter inability to attain to justification and sanctification by works of the law. Jeremiah 10:23. O Lord, I know that the way of man is not in himself. It is not a man that walketh to direct his steps. Jeremiah 10:23. And to demonstrate in just and adequate terms the exceeding sinfulness of sins, the necessity of holiness as a condition and a means of happiness. These and other like problems primarily are preliminary to the full development of the scheme of redemption were committed to the Jews, and about 1,500 years were allowed for their solution. So there's, okay. The history then of the Jews during this time period is therefore the subject of intense interest to every student of human nature and of the laws and principles of divine government. To the enlightened Christian philosopher, every fact embraced in it is an exponent then of some great principle. That's why Romans chapter 15 and verse 4 is so important. Whatsoever things are written aforetime are written for our learning. We through patient comfort of the scriptures might have hope. Now, he talks about Sir Isaac. But on the discussion then of this subject, we cannot now enter. To do it justice would require at least a respectable octavo. I think it's something. Anyway, I must therefore simply request the reader to study for himself all the historical and prophetical books of the Old Testament from the beginning of Judges to the end of Malachi. So he just kind of,
Throws it out.
yeah. But there's some important stuff. And some of this he's going to go back and he's going to talk about some of these things, and he will mention. He will there find the developed and great variety of circumstances and all the principles and proclivities of the human heart. He will see the actual working of God's providence and operation of the divine government on both the penitent and impenitent. And unless he is blinded by prejudice and infatuated through the influence of his own false philosophies, he will finally conclude with Paul that by the deeds of the law shall no flesh living be justified, and that the system of redemption by grace through faith is indispensable in order to the salvation of mankind. Okay. So now we're going to kind of shift gears and we're going to talk about the Gentiles. Okay. All right. To them, and he's talking about the Gentiles. This is the second sentence there on page 201. We're also committed a solution for very important problems, and particularly the problem of ascertaining whether or not natural religion is adequate to the wants of our fallen race. So what he's talking about when he's talking about natural religion, he's talking about what emanates from ourselves. We can't save ourselves. Really, it's what he's going to accomplish. Okay. Now he says
The Gentiles believe that.
that's what he's saying the Gentiles believe. Okay. And he's going to prove that we cannot be saved then from this natural religion. But he also then, and I like what he says, we're descendants of Noah. Now notice there's a little star there. The unity has mankind been proved. I think this, you got to understand how long ago he wrote this and what he's showing. All right, in Acts 17:26, God hath made of one blood all nations of the earth to dwell on the face of the earth. All right. Fact number 2, okay, from the fact that all men are endowed with the same physical and intellectual, moral, and religious faculties.
And that's something to be said back in that day.
I'm telling you.
Because of the prejudice.
Right. And from the fact that Christ took upon himself the nature of but one of the species, and when he does that, he's talking about animal species, all of that, and said to have tasted death for every man. Okay. Hebrews 2:9. Go on the next page because we're going to notice this little thing. All right. Number 4, from the fact that God has given to mankind but one moral and religious code or system, and that this has been found to be equally adapted to the wants and happiness of all. Number 5, from the fact that hybrids such as mules have not the capacity to propagate. All right.
Reproduce.
That's right. They can't reproduce. But the varieties of mankind's intermarry and propagate the human species.
Now, that's something.
All right. So I'm telling you. And from the fact that all mankind were originally of one language. Number 7, from the fact that all mankind, say Noah and his family were destroyed by flood. I am aware of the universality of the Noahic deluge, and has been denied by many modern writers and especially by the geologists. And so he's going to talk about that but we'll skip down to number 8. From the fact that no satisfactory division of their genus homos has ever been made by the advocates of a plurality of species.
Knocking down.
these
Evolution.
Yes, these gentlemen cannot agree among themselves whether as to the number of species that compose the human race. Now, he's talking about the difference in, race, creed, and color. Some making color along the grounds of their classifications. See, you can't do that.
And he's saying that's not right.
That's right, and this is just really, to me, leaps in
They
the
can't agree, so that shows their fallacy.
Right.
there.
Number 9, he says, from the fact that the unity of the human race is taught in all systems of heathen mythology and treat the origin of mankind. And then he talks about that. And we'll go back and we'll notice that in the regular text. But that, to me, this was profound.
It was during that time.
When you think of when he's writing and the prejudice that was occurring between the races, this man is far and above his peers.
When did he write?
Uh,
All I have is the last publication.
Mine was public in 1972. So
Mine was in 77, so before, I thought it was like in the 1800s.
let's notice something else. Let's see. A lot of times they'll have a preface. Look on page 15 of the preface. Kentucky University, May 19th, 1868. So we're talking about the end of the
Right at the end of the Civil War, when prejudice was rampant.
So when you think about when this was being written,
And in the South,
University of in
Kentucky.
yes, and it was then Kentucky. It had Kentucky University had its roots then with a church. It really did.
Isn't it?
All right. So that was amazing to me, and I thought I'd bring that out. On 203 then, page 203. And we're talking about then, here is this Gentile world, okay? And he's going to talk about these different groups of people throughout over here and over there and everywhere. So I'll let him do this. And hence we find traces of it in history of at least all the most enlightened nation, tribes, and families of the world. Huh? This idea of religion,
Oh, yes, yes.
Okay.
Religion is basic.
okay? And not only, but sometimes they talk about the flood and this type of thing.
They all have that in their history.
Yes. So he starts then the sacred books of Hindus, give a reference then we find to the following. Reference of God and Creator and all things. Originally there was soul only, he thought. I will create worlds. So he created worlds. Then I will create guardians of the world. And he framed out of the water and molded beings and showed him to the deities whom he had made. So he talks about that. At the bottom of that paragraph, these imaginary gods amounting to about 333 million gods. Okay, that's the religion of India. Then he goes on in the next paragraph, in the Greek and Roman classics, there is frequent reference to the supreme God. But he is generally thrown so far in the background of their theology that he can scarcely be recognized. Then he talks about Plato. That's the first one. Then he talks about on the next page Socrates, 204, at the beginning of the page. Then Plato, he mentions these men, Cicero, then all of these men. Look at the last paragraph, the last sentence on that. What a commentary is all this on saying of Paul that the world by wisdom knew not God. And then he goes on with the Egyptians while speaking of the theology of the Egyptians then. They have a vague idea of the unity of God lingered in the background of his metaphysical system long after it had ceased to have any practical effects. Then on page 205, among the North American Indians, we find fuller, clearer, and more perfect recognition of the one supreme being than we find in any history of any other heathen people. Now they call it the fan or the great spirit. Now they develop this then into thunder, the lightnings, and indeed the phenomena of nature. But still there is this idea of a supreme being, okay? Then he talks about, on the bottom of page 205, the ancient Aztecs or Mexicans.
They sacrificed.
All right, were recognized to worship one supreme God, though,
Yeah, they did.
under whom they ranked and served 13 principal deities. But that's the thing. That is corrupt. I understand that. That's how they corrupted the religion, but they started out with one supreme. All right, on page 206 there.
The fact they had sacrifices is really
Yes.
interesting.
According to the most reliable account that we have of the religion of the ancient Peruvians, they too had a supreme being among whom they called Khan. Okay. And then right there at that indent where the scriptures illustrate by these facts, notice he says, I think sufficient for our present purpose. They abundantly demonstrate the truth of what Paul says in Romans chapter 1, verses 21 through 23. When they, that is the Gentiles, knew God, and glorified him not as God, neither were thankful and became vain in their imaginations, and their speculations and their foolish hearts were darkened. Professing themselves to be wise, they became fools and changed the glory of the incorruptible God to an image made like the corruptible man, into birds and the four-footed beasts and creeping things. But this shows me then and tells me that these folks knew about God, yet they did not keep an accurate record of what God and who God was.
They weren't the only
Yeah.
Jews made
Right.
calves.
Right. So the progress of the Gentiles into idolatry is, as in other vices, was gradual. Now, mark that too. Every sin is a gradual sin. The bringing in of instrumental music into the church was gradual. If you go back to 1836, those type of things, when it came into Midway, Kentucky, it was then gradual. The first step
That's what it takes.
in it was the deification and worshipers of the ancestors. Okay. And then this Sir William Jones has a very able article and endeavored to prove that all the principal gods of Europe, Asia, and Africa were identical. And I think that's interesting.
Well, they're very common.
All right. As Noah begat Shem, Ham, and Japheth, so Saturn was said to have begotten Jupiter, Neptune, and Pluto. And then there's another one then.
Wrong.
Okay. Their next step in idolatry was worship the heavenly bodies. Okay. Now, the Hindus, drop down a couple of pages. The Hindus have a tradition that the rishis who are preserved in the ark became after their death the souls of the 7 stars of the Great Bear.
Which is stars.
Yes. And the souls then of their wives were in like manner transferred to the Pleiades. Well, Job talks about the Pleiades. The ancient Egyptians believed that Helios was the first king and had been translated into the sun. That's why they worshiped the sun. All right. Now the next paragraph. Other objects of worship were easily added to these newly created divinities. And very soon all animated nature was defined.
Deified.
It was deified, yes. I knew that. So we progressed then. So in some cases, the progress of era stopped with polytheism, and others it resulted in pantheism. So this was manifest tendency of philosophies among all Gentiles who were not restrained by the traditions of their ancestors. Plato then saw and felt this. Okay. Then on page 208, All right. He says religion was tolerated by the state by means of controlling and governing the passions of the multitude. Do you see that? I go 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, the seventh line.
Yes. That's what commented, what Mark says.
Yes.
In the, is that it was, religion was primitive man's way of explaining the unexplained.
Well, it was the opium of the masses, one of them said too.
Yeah,
All right, so here is, but when Pilate,
contemptuously.
yes, contemptuously said to Christ, "What is truth?" he expressed the common sentiment of the most of the politicians and public men of the empire. How true it is, then, there was a remark by John Locke that in the time of Christ, philosophies had spent its strength and it's done its utmost. Now he has a star there. So I want to drop down into probably the third of this. And you'll see where the Jewish religion, all right, the Jewish religion in Phariseeism had stiffened to its spiritualistness and self-righteous formalism. And Sadduceeism had but emptied all its moral and religious earnestness. So this is what Jesus was fighting at this time. This is what, all right, now drop down the expectation of the coming Messiah in various forms and degrees of clearness were at the time by the political intellectuals and the religious contact and collision of the nations spread over the whole world. Okay. Then over on the next page 209, we're going to come back. And you see where the Holy One, it's the third line down, Holy One who should appear in the West, the wise astrologers who came to Jerusalem to worship the newborn King of the Jews. We must look upon the most noble representatives of the messianic hopes of the Oriental heathen. So here they knew something about that star that would appear in the east. Okay? And so that shows us that the heathens knew something. And the Gentiles knew something of the true religion. And I think when you look at
Well, they had to because of Jonah.
Jonah, that's right, was told to go to preach to Nineveh, that great city. There was some responsibility of the Gentile world to know Christ or to know God. All right, now on page 209, back up there at the beginning, at the top of the page. From our premise, thus briefly stated and illustrated, is evident, therefore, that natural religion is not a religion adequate to the wants and the necessities of mankind. For, I like this. Number one, it wants the authority that is necessary to restrain their evil passions and propensities. You know, whatever feels good, do it. That's what we've gotten into today. There's no authority. Who are you going to appeal to? I don't believe in God.
That's easy.
It does not beget and cherish in the human heart a consciousness of sin and a hungering and thirsting after righteousness. Third, it has, and this is important, it has no sin offering for the relief of the guilty conscience, no means of cleansing, the purifying the human soul from the polluting power and influence of sin.
Most of those Asian religions do not have a method by which you can repent and have your sins forgiven.
All right, that's what he said. All right, and that's then come drop down to the last sentence. And hence the next great event in the divine administration was the coming of him whom the law and the prophets and all the prophets had spoken. So, huh?
That's powerful.
Yes, it is. So now we're going to notice the ministry of John the Baptist on page 210. And notice this part, the developments in the life, the death, and the burial, and the resurrection, ascension, and the coronation of Christ. So we're going to start with John the Baptist. Not deal much with him, but we're going to talk about then Christ.
You have to deal with John the Baptist. in order to deal with Christ.
Well, that's true.
He is the link between the old and the new.
Right. We are told by the ancient historian that when the Eastern monarchs were about to set out on an important expedition, it was their custom to send harbingers or heralds in advance of their armies with orders to provide supplies, make bridges, find the best fording places over streams, level hills, construct causeway, cut down forest, and in a word, do whatever might be necessary to prepare the way before them. Oh, good introduction to John the Baptist. Okay? And just so did Christ make his advent into this world. And then he's going to talk about then the 40th chapter of Isaiah, the voice of one crying in the wilderness. Prepare you the way of the Lord, make straight in his desert a highway for our God. Every valley shall be exalted, every mountain shall be made low, and the crooked shall be made straight, the rough places plain, and the glory of the Lord shall be revealed, and all flesh shall see it together. For the mouth of the Lord has spoken it. Put a period there, because when God speaks it, that's it.
No matter if you believe it.
That's right. The primary reference to this prophecy is the Lord's leading Israel from Babylon up again into Jerusalem. This is evident from the context, but that Isaiah refers here also to the coming of Christ's ministry of his harbinger John the Baptist. It was obvious from Matthew chapter 3 and verse 3, Mark 1, 2 and 3, Luke 1:76, Luke 3, 2 through 6, John 1:23. Also see Malachi 3:1 and 4, 5, and 6. Be it observed, however, that the obstacles in the way of Christ's advent were not such as impeded the march of the earthly monarchs, nor were they even such as Jehovah himself had encountered in leading his people up through the great and terrible wilderness that lay between Babylon and Jerusalem. It was not a literal mountains and valleys, nor was it hostility and opposition of the semi-barbarous tribes, but it was the infidelity of the wickedness of his own kindred and chosen people that Christ had to overcome before he could, with propriety, set up his kingdom. Okay? That's why he gave them power to become sons of God, but they didn't. In that first chapter of John. At this time, all right, it's stated in the previous chapter that the Jews as well as the Gentiles had at that time almost filled up the cup of their iniquity. Right, continuing the next sentence down after we've finished on page 212. Right at the top of the page.
Okay.
You see that?
Yes.
Okay.
Okay.
All right. And had not God just used extraordinary means to check the tide of corruption that was threatening to inundate the whole earth, another flood would have no doubt very soon have been necessary to free the world from a population as deprived as were in the abandoned antediluvians. And it wasn't going to happen because I understand.
He's already promised not to do that.
That's right. That's what the rainbow means.
He's just going to throw fire.
Right. So to remove these obstacles then, and to prepare the Jews for the coming great hero, I like this, was the special work of John the Baptizer. When he was about 30 years of age, he appeared in the wilderness of Judea with a clarion voice that echoed and reverberated throughout its hills and its valleys, and with the earnestness that roused into activity the slumbering energies of the whole nation. How beautiful. He called on the people to repent of their sins, to cease to do evil and learn to do well. Thus, he was preparing them for the approaching reign of heaven. His appeal was not in vain, for he told that Jerusalem, or for we are told that Jerusalem, all Judea, and all the regions round about the Jordan went out to him and were baptized by him in the Jordan, confessing their sins. Matthew 3, 5 and 6. Also see Mark 1, 4 through 8, and Luke 3, 8 through 3 through 18. Here then, we have a few words of the whole scope of John's ministry. It was simply to prepare the people for the Lord. He neither changed nor abrogated the existing laws and institution of his country. He added nothing but to them save baptism, which he himself had received directly from heaven. And some people, when they then don't even think that baptism was even added. Those who were baptized by him rose from their liquid graves, subject to all respects to the laws and the institution of Moses. And it might do us well to understand that John the Baptist baptized for the remission of sins, but it looked forward to the time when Christ would die. And that's why in Acts 19, those people who had been baptized by Apollos had to be rebaptized, because at that time when they were taught Christ's baptism was in effect not John's, and they had to be baptized for the remission of sins looking back. All right, the only change in their condition was a death to sin and a resurrection to the life of holiness, preparatory to the coming of their anxiously looked for Messiah. And that, to me, is also what the sacrifice is then in Hebrews chapter 10, verses 1 through 4, and we'll get into that too. All right. In this work of reformation, John and his disciples continued to labor, and is generally supposed for about a year and a half. He was then imprisoned by Herod Antipas, and then he was beheaded by Herod at the request of his stepdaughter Salome. Matthew chapter 14. Okay. What a tragedy. But he's preached the truth then.
But he had to end.
Yes, he had, yeah.
It had to end.
I must decrease and he must increase.
John probably knew he's going to die.
Well,
He had to
in one
end.
aspect, we all are going to die. But
No,
I mean,
but I mean, he knew he had to die when Christ.
all right. So now we're going to talk about Christ's nature, character, and personality.
fulfilled his role.
Okay. The question of who is Christ and what is Christ are matters of paramount importance to our entire race. And I think this is also paramount to our question and talking about the scheme of redemption. These are matters that have largely occupied the attention of consideration of the whole civilized world for more than 1,800 years. It'd be 2,000 years now. And even today, they are still growing in the freshness and in interest. Okay. All right, let me go on, because some make Christ into one thing and some another.
And where are you?
At the bottom of the page on 213. But all who profess to receive the Bible as the Word of God, some of the ancients, dreaming, semi-infidel Gnostics. Oh, Gnosticism. This is the book of Colossians then, okay? And I think also 1 John, when you get into that book, and what they, what they say about it, and I want to deal with this. Colossians.
That's why I didn't put 2 S's.
All right. Now, when you follow down, of course, he says this is coming from the Gibbon's Decline and Fall of the Roman Empire. If you come down to middle of the paragraph, well, not middle of the paragraph. Look on that. The outside, you see this Docetes, okay? While his blood was still recent on Calvary's, the Docetus and numerous and learned sects of the
Asiatic.
Asiatics invented a fantastic system, which afterwards propagated by the
Marcionite.
yeah, them I've heard of, and the other ones then, and the various names of the Gnostic heresies. Gnostic then comes from the word know, the Greek word know. K-N-O. They deny the truth and the authenticity of the gospel so far as they relate to the conception of Mary, the birth of Christ, and the 30 years that preceded the exercise of his ministry. He first appeared on the banks of the Jordan in the form of a perfect manhood, but it was a form only and not a substance. That's what Gnostic talks about. It is a form, not a substance. A phantom, almost. A human figure created by the hand of the omnipotent and to imitate the faculties and actions of man to impose a perpetual illusion on the senses of his friends and enemies. Articulate sounds reverberated on their ears of the disciples, but the image which was impressed upon the optic nerve eluded the more stubborn evidence of touch and even enjoyed the spiritual, not corporal, presence of the Son of God. That's why in 1 John chapter 1, he talks about that which we have seen with our eyes, heard with our ears, and we've touched. Okay? So there's 5 of those senses. That's what he's, 3 of, that's why he's talking about this. All right? The rage of the Jews was idly wasted against the impressive phantom and the mystic scenes of the passion and the death and the resurrection of the Ascension of Christ were represented on the theater of Jerusalem for the benefit of mankind. Now go on down in the next paragraph. It says, in the life of Christ, that he had a historical evidence and that he was, moreover, a man of great genius, power, and religious influence. You cannot deny. That's what they're talking about there. You cannot deny this, that he had these things. This Dr. David Frederick Strauss, the great champion of mythical hypotheses.
He's talking about Christ himself, right?
Yeah, concedes in his life of Christ that he had a sort, all right? Then down here at the bottom, it says, what do the scriptures, the second from, or the third from the bottom, what do the scriptures, when fairly interpreted, teach us concerning Jesus of Nazareth? This was properly ascertained to us at least an end of all controversy. So he's saying that Christ actually was not in this myth, that he actually did.
You got too much evidence.
Yeah.
He actually
lived. That's right. Okay. So, all right. So we come back up here and we talked about the Gnostics then, and a few other ancient sectaries. Then back at the top of the page on 214.
Okay.
Right after the Gnostics, the word Gnostics.
Okay.
You see where I am?
Mm-hmm.
Okay, that little star.
Oh yeah, and a few other ancient sectaries.
All right. Agreed that he was a man, not a myth or not a phantom, not a mere creation of some fruitful imagination, but a man, a real person having a human body and human soul. Okay. No other hypotheses can we possibly account for the facts connected with his birth, his early education, his baptism, his temptation in the wilderness, his public ministry, his crucifixion, his burial, his resurrection, his subsequent interview with his disciples, and his ascension into glory. We shall therefore henceforth regard and treat the question of Christ's complete, perfect human as a settled matter. So he's not going to, he said there's enough.
That's it.
Yeah, there's enough evidence there that this is not a question. Gnosticism is not true. Okay.
It's not an accepted thing, it's a fact.
That's right. Now, but what about his divinity? Okay, now that's a good question. And I think that's a good place, really. We'll start right there next week, talking about his divinity. I think that's a good place. Oh, and guess what? If you're taking this for credit,
Today's the 19th, so
you've got a midterm coming up, which will be next week. Okay. So expect that in the mail, and get it to me as soon as you can. But that's what you need to do. Okay. I'm
2 weeks.
Yeah, 2 weeks would be good if you can get it done in 2 weeks, but we're going to still lecture in the class, okay? We won't be able to not do that. We have to have that lecture. So anyway, I know it's not like real class, but that's what we have to do, okay? All right, you'll do fine. It's an open book test. If you want to do that, then that's fine too, but so, I don't mind. There's no way I can control that, so I don't mind you using the book. Okay. All right. We'll see y'all next week then.